Hi everybody, this is going to be our video to finish the fluid balance, which we got to the acid-base part, and then I do want to start the endocrine. All right, so Dr. J here, let's just finish this acid-base balance part, and then we'll start endocrine. Okay folks, so you remember that for this chapter, we had three main parts. The first part was water balance. Just overall water fluid balance. Where we house fluid, we house about 2/3 of our fluid intracellularly, whereas the remaining 33% or so is outside the cells. We talked about ways in which our body brings in water the most, ways in which we get rid of water the most. We talked about the constant movement of water between compartments and places in the body. And then lastly, we talked about the two main hormones that are responsible for overseeing fluid balance, which would be antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Excuse me. And then the place in the brain that oversees our fluid balance would be the hypothalamus. That was part one. Then we talked about part two, which was the electrolyte balance, and we focused on potassium and sodium. We said that they work together, but on different sides of the cell membrane. So we find potassium in much higher amounts inside the cells, and we find sodium in much higher amounts outside the cells. They're constantly moving back and forth, and we said collectively together, with a coordinated movement, potassium and sodium, they work together. I gave three functions. They help with fluid balance, and they're needed for a muscle contraction and a nerve impulse. And then we talked about three hormones that play a role in the electrolyte imbalance. The same two beginning ones, ADH and aldosterone. And then we added one more, which is natriuretic peptide hormone, our salt-releasing hormone. All right, so here we are with our final part, water balance, electrolyte balance, and now we get to acid-base balance. We ended off our last lecture in person talking about the definition of an acid and a base, so please review that. Now I want to add a couple things. Let's talk about a strong acid and a weak acid or base. You may remember that in lecture we defined an acid as something that, when put into a solution, so let's say we have a beaker and it just has water in it. If we put an acid, let's see if I can zoom in here. If we put an acid into a solution, the acid will release hydrogen into the solution. So the key word for an acid is that it releases hydrogen ions into the solution. On the other hand, when we talked about a base, again, we can have a beaker filled with fluid. When we talk about a base, like baking soda, when we add base to a solution, it actually picks up hydrogen. So the acid releases hydrogen into the solution, whereas the base picks up hydrogen. As a result, an acidic solution has a lot of hydrogen ions and is low on the pH scale. Whereas a base, because it actually picks up hydrogen, the resulting solution has a low amount of hydrogen ions, but is represented on the high end of the pH scale. That's a review from what we did in person. Now what I want to do is just add strong versus weak. I'm going to use the acid as an example, even though the same is true for the base. In a strong acid or base, the substances, in this case the hydrogen ions, dissociate, or another word for dissociate is spread out. So in a strong acid, for example, the hydrogen will spread out completely and evenly. And that's kind of what I've drawn up here. This is what a strong acid would look like, because the hydrogen spread out evenly in the solution. For comparison's sake, let's draw what a weak acid might look like. Now, an acid, no matter what it is still going to release hydrogen into a solution. It's going to release hydrogen ions into a solution. What makes it a weak acid is that the hydrogen ions do not spread out completely and evenly. So notice, that's my cat over there. Notice the strong one. The hydrogen spreads out completely and evenly. There's equal amounts of hydrogen in all parts of the solution. There's hydrogen over here. There's hydrogen over here. So in a strong acid, the hydrogen ions spread out completely and evenly. In a weak acid, the hydrogen ions do not spread out completely. Instead, they just spread out a little bit. So they spread out here, but not here. We're being pretty general, but that's okay. So in a strong acid or base, the release or the picking up of hydrogen ions is evenly and it's complete. So in a strong acid, the substance spreads out or picks up completely and evenly for the most part. In a weak, they do not spread out completely. All right. These next couple things you don't need to know, because I want to focus on this. This topic can get really chemical. But folks, aren't you happy you have me? Let's make a smiley face just to belabor the point. We are not going to get all chemical. Yay! But it's important that we get the main point home, because without these buffer systems, our blood would become out of pH all the time, out of the normal pH range. So a buffer system is something in our body that works to buffer against large changes in pH. That's where it gets the word buffer. We already know the normal pH range of blood, 7.35 to 7.45. It's a narrow range, folks. So how are we going to keep our blood pH in that very narrow range? We have to have these systems in place. We don't want the pH to go below 7.35. We don't want it to shift above 7.35. So that's exactly what buffer systems are. Things that work to prevent those shifts too high or too low. We have two types. Folks, we already know the physiological buffers. These are the body systems, and they're long-term. We already know the two main body systems that help to regulate pH, the respiratory and the urinary. And you already know how. How does the respiratory system help to regulate pH? Because we have the ability to breathe out more or less CO2. You already know that. How does the urinary system help to regulate pH? Because we have the ability to reabsorb more or less. Let me hear it, folks. I don't hear you. Bicarbonate. These are long term, but it takes a while to get there. So we need something in the short term as a quick Band-Aid. So what we're talking about now is the chemical buffers. These are our short-term. This is our short-term way to regulate pH. It is indeed like a Band-Aid, but Band-Aids still have a function because it quickly can maintain pH to buy us time, because we're always going to want to be going and shifting to our long-term, more permanent ways to fix pH. So what is a chemical buffer system? A chemical buffer system is a group of chemicals in the bloodstream, and all they do is they help to, in the short term, regulate pH. Group of chemicals in the bloodstream. Their only job is to regulate pH. Let's talk about them. So what are they? Chemical buffers, short term. It's a group of chemicals that circulate in the blood, and their only function is to regulate pH. There's 3 different types. We're going to talk about this one. Carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. It sounds all fancy, but it doesn't have to be. Again, it's a group of chemicals that circulate in the bloodstream, and their only job is to regulate pH in the short term, to buy us time until we can get to a more permanent way to get rid of hydrogen ions or regulate pH, the respiratory and the urinary. So here's what you need to know. All chemical buffer systems have the same 3 components: weak base, weak acid, and hydrogen ions. I don't really care about the hydrogen part here, but I do care about weak acid, weak base, and hydrogen ions. Please notice, folks, it's weak. And it's weak by design. We want it to be a weak. Yes, my cat's saying the same thing. I think I mentioned this at the end of class last week, but let's understand the basics of how this works. How do these chemical buffer systems work? What they do is they release either the weak acid or the weak base, depending on what's needed, to bring the pH back to normal. It's a short-term solution. These buffer systems have both weak acid and a weak base. So in the short term, let's say my blood becomes too acidic. If my blood becomes too acidic, what can I add to it to temporarily bring the pH back to normal? If my problem is, if my blood is too acidic, I can temporarily add a base to counteract that acidity. On the other hand, what if my blood becomes too basic? Well, then what I can do is I can temporarily add an acid. So we have the ability to add the opposite. If it's too acidic, we add the base. If it's too basic, we add the acid. It's not a long-term solution, but it's a temporary fix, just long enough until we can use our more permanent. We're going to talk more about it. It's true that the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is more active in the extracellular fluid outside of cells, and the phosphate is more active in the intracellular fluid and the urine. But you don't need to know that. Here's what I want to talk about. We have the same generalized equilibrium equation. We have seen it all semester. CO2 plus water yields H2CO3, which is carbonic acid, which can yield HCO3, which is bicarbonate, plus hydrogen ions. You don't need to know the specifics. I'm not going to ask you to draw this out. However, this generalized equation shows us what a chemical buffer system is. What does every chemical buffer have to have? A weak acid? Check. In this system, the carbonic acid is the weak acid. Every chemical buffer system must have a weak base. HCO3 negative, bicarbonate, weak base. And every chemical buffer system must have hydrogen ions. So folks, here is what lays out our carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Each chemical buffer system has a weak acid, check, a weak base, check, and hydrogen ions. So let's give an example. Let's say, what happens if blood pH drops? Isn't that the more common thing to happen? Your blood pH has the potential to drop so many times. If you have some orange juice, if you have some tomato sauce, if you have anything acidic, you exercise, we start to produce lactic acid. We burn fat for energy. We start to burn fat and we produce ketones. There's so many things that can make our blood acidic. If you hold your breath, we have a buildup of CO2. That could make your blood acidic. So even if you're not actually exercising, even if you don't realize it, there's constantly things that are added to your blood that could make it acidic. So we have to be able to counteract that. So what happens if our blood pH drops? If our problem is too much acid, what do we want to temporarily release? The weak base. The beauty of the chemical buffer system is it will just add the opposite. If our blood's too acidic, we're going to want to release the base. It has to be a weak base. I think I have to sneeze. Hold on. Excuse me. Excuse me. We have to have it be a weak base because we want this reaction to be temporary. Because a minute later, maybe now pH is back to normal, and now it's gotten to be too high, where it's too basic. We might need to actually add acid. So we want it to be a weak acid or base so that it is not a complete reaction and we can more easily move between one or the other. My apologies. So here's our example. When blood pH drops, it's too acidic, we're going to want to release the opposite. If our blood is too acidic, we want to release the base. In terms of the equation, and this I would like you to memorize, when blood pH drops or is too acidic, we release the base. That means that this equation shifts to the left. Because by shifting to the left, which are we dissociating or releasing? The weak acid or the weak base? The weak base. That's all we need to understand from this. We don't need to get into the chemistry of it. Notice this generalized equation has all the ingredients of a chemical buffer system. Notice the arrows are bidirectional, so we can move these around as needed. If our blood pH drops, we want to release or dissociate the weak base, in which case the equation moves to the left. That's all you need to know. If it was the opposite, what happens if our blood pH goes up? If our blood pH goes up, it's too basic. What are we going to release to counteract it? If our blood is too basic, we want to release the acid. In the equation, when we dissociate or release the acid, the equation shifts to the right. That's all you need to know. Don't worry about the phosphate buffer system. As an aside, there are also some proteins that can act as buffers. Excuse me. But you don't need to know that. You don't need to know this either. I got down a little rabbit hole about the ability of our urinary system to generate new bicarbonate, but you don't need to know any of these. Now, this equation can also show us the longer term, and that's just why I like to use this. Excuse me. This equation can also show us the long term. We can utilize our lungs by breathing out more or less CO2. If pH goes down, if pH is too acidic, don't we want to exhale more CO2? So anytime we want to exhale more CO2, we move the equation to the left so we can, remember, we transport CO2 as bicarbonate in the bloodstream, but if we want to actually breathe out that CO2, we've got to move the equation all the way to the left to reform free CO2 so we can breathe it out. I'm not going to use this equation more specifically for this. I'm just reminding us how the lungs and the kidneys can also regulate pH. It's a reminder. The left part of the equation just happens to show us how the lungs can do it by breathing out more or less CO2. The right part of the equation, we can take bicarbonate to the kidneys. because the kidneys, how can they help regulate pH? If pH goes down, again, that's more common. If our pH goes down too acidic, we're going to reabsorb more bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is basic or alkaline. So if my pH is too low, it's too acidic, I want to reabsorb more base to counteract it. Okay. Some things just to finish this out. Make sure you know what the definition of acidosis is. Acidosis is when the pH drops below the normal range. You don't have to know all the specifics, just know the definition. Acidosis, when the blood pH drops below the normal range. What is alkalosis? When the blood pH goes above the normal pH range. I do want to point this out. I know you are not necessarily clinical medical people, but I think this is an important thing to point out because it can still relate to athletes. Acidosis and alkalosis. Imbalances in our acid base tend to be caused by only two things, which is actually pretty cool. So most of our acidosis situations are caused by either a respiratory problem or a metabolic problem. And I would like you to know that. What are the two main causes of an acid-base imbalance? What are the two main causes of an acid-base imbalance? Respiratory or metabolic? For example, respiratory acidosis. It sounds maybe more fancy than it needs to be. We already know what acidosis means. Acidosis means that the blood pH has dropped below the normal range. When we say respiratory acidosis, it means that the blood pH dropped below the normal range due to a buildup of CO2. So it means that the acidosis was caused by a respiratory problem. Respiratory acid, a buildup of CO2. On the other hand, the second most common is a metabolic acidosis. We already know what acidosis means. Acidosis means when the blood pH drops below the normal range. Now we know metabolic acidosis, it's a metabolic cause. A buildup, the cause of the acidosis is a buildup of metabolic byproducts or chemical reactions. We talked about two, lactic acid. The blood becomes acidic because of a buildup of lactate. Ketoacidosis, the blood becomes acidic due to a buildup of ketones. As an interesting sidebar, to compensate for this, the body will do the opposite. You don't have to know this, but it's just interesting. So if someone is suffering from metabolic acidosis, we're going to try and fix it through the respiratory system. If someone is suffering from a respiratory acidosis, we're going to try and fix it using a metabolic thing, like the kidneys. Okay. Okay. I want to end there for that one. I thought that I brought in, yes. You will see on bright space, under your fluid balance, there's another PowerPoint with fluid balance examples. I'm not going to have you do this for a test or anything, but I wanted to give you some examples. Now, again, you're not going to be clinical people, most likely, but I just wanted to show you. This will not be on the test. This fluid volume stuff, fluid balance stuff, is prevalent in so many things. It's not just when an athlete is dehydrated. It is not just when someone is overhydrated. For example, heart failure. Did you know if someone's in heart failure, it can lead to a disruption in fluid balance? So if someone's in the hospital, they want to monitor the fluid intake and the fluid output. So I'm just giving you examples. If someone has heart failure and their heart's not able to pump out as much blood, it will disrupt the kidney's ability to maintain fluid balance because the kidneys are not getting enough fluid because the heart can't pump it out to it. So this is an example of what it might look like with someone who has heart failure. These are the ways in which the hospital, they might have fluid intake. These are the ways in which, so I've added it up. These are the ways in which they might have fluid output. And when you're in the hospital, they want to see how much fluid is being drained through the chest tube, how much fluid is coming out through the nasogastric tube. So in this example, they have brought in so much more than they can output. Again, because of their heart not working properly, it's not pumping enough to the kidney, so they're not peeing enough. If I can't pee enough, I'm going to be retaining more fluid, and that just tends to put more pressure on the blood vessels, more pressure on the heart. Fluid overloaded is not a good thing. Would this person want a diuretic or an antidiuretic? If they're fluid overloaded, they would want a diuretic to help their kidneys get rid of more. So again, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but this fluid balance business is so important. Heart problems can lead to a fluid imbalance, and it can lead to real problems. Kidney disease can obviously lead to kidney problems. So again, this is just an example. I would not ask you to do this. Someone is in a hospital. These are ways in which they might be bringing in fluid. These are ways in which they might be releasing fluid. So here we have a fluid intake of this much, a fluid output of this much. So are they fluid overloaded or are they dehydrated? They're fluid overloaded, so that they would also need the diuretic. Then I have the example of the endurance athlete that you are free to look through. I'm not going to ask you these on a test, but I just wanted to show you, okay? All right, so I don't want to go too long into beginning the endocrine system, but I just want to start. This will not be on your test on Thursday. This will not be on your test. The test material will be only urinary and fluid balance. But because we're coming down to the end of the semester, I need to start this at least. We have 2 chapters left, folks, endocrine and reproductive. And more, the endocrine is really important for athletes. So I just want to introduce this, and then we'll finish this in our next in-person lecture. So let's just introduce the endocrine system. When you think of endocrine, you're probably going to think of hormones, and that's correct. We think about hormones and glands. Endocrine, hormones and glands. What is it comprised of? Glands, the hormones those glands secrete, and then the target cells would be where those hormones go to have their action. Right now, let's just focus on glands and hormones. Have a look at this lovely young man here. We can see that there's glands located all throughout the body. This is a little bit different than our other body systems. We were talking about the respiratory. Well, the respiratory system its organs are pretty much focused in the thoracic and the chest. The kidneys, we just finished that chapter. Those organs are pretty much in the abdominal region. Well, hormones secreted by glands are all throughout the body. So we have glands in our brain, we have glands in our throat, above our heart, above the kidneys, the pancreas is a gland, and then of course we have the ovaries and the testes. So we have glands located all throughout the body. They're not necessarily connected. What we're going to see is hormones get released into the bloodstream. So once the hormones are in the bloodstream, that's how they're going to go everywhere. But the glands themselves, they're kind of spread out throughout the body. What is the function of the endocrine system? To regulate In the famous words of Warren G. Excuse me again. The endocrine system regulates the body. What are our two regulatory systems, nervous and endocrine? What are our two regulatory systems, nervous and endocrine? The nervous system will communicate through nerve impulses. The endocrine communicates through hormones. Okay, I'm not going to get too worked up about these two. I just want to talk about these two things. Basically, we have, bear with me, let me use green. We have something called local or paracrine hormones. Don't worry about this for now. I'm just introducing, there's a type of hormone that's considered to be local. And sometimes we give that term paracrine. And what that means is the hormones that are released, in this case, travel short distances, not just glands. So in this picture here, they're trying to show you the paracrine or local hormones. And our local hormones don't go into the bloodstream. That's why I like this picture. Again, don't worry about the top here. A local hormone only travels short distances, not in the bloodstream. So you can notice in this picture, hormones do not go into bloodstream. So they're not widespread effects. Instead, they just travel to nearby cells. This is how a lot of cells communicate to each other. So one way that this cell might communicate with local cells is by releasing these local hormones. So when you hear paracrine hormone, it's a local hormone, how one cell might communicate to nearby cells. On the other hand, the hormone that you're normally thinking of would travel into the bloodstream. So the hormone, the regular hormone, the traditional hormone, for lack of a better word, the regular hormones, these are not local. Travel into bloodstream. Travel through bloodstream. So this is what you think of when you think of a hormone. Growth hormone goes into the bloodstream, can go to every bone and muscle. Testosterone travels through the bloodstream, can go to every cell in the body. So we have local hormones. Thank you, Oscar. He came to say hi. We have local hormones called paracrine hormones. They only travel locally. But the traditional hormone goes into the bloodstream, and therefore its effects are widespread. My cat Oscar apparently is excited about hormones. Now, I do want to make sure that we just compare and contrast the two body systems that regulate, endocrine versus nervous. These are the two main body systems that control everything. If you think back to AMP1, we already know the nervous system works through nerve impulses. Nerve impulses travel quickly, but they only have localized effects. When you send a nerve impulse, it only goes to one specific spot. It's a quick response, but short-lasting. If I send a nerve impulse to a muscle, it's going to contract the muscle, and if I don't continue to send nerve impulses, it will not contract any longer. So the nervous system communicates to the body through nerve impulses that are quick, have localized effects. Each nerve impulse can only go to a specific spot. It's quick, which is good, but the effects are shorter lasting. Let's contrast that to the endocrine. The endocrine system is going to communicate through hormones. Hormones take longer. they work more slowly. It takes time for a gland to release a hormone, for the hormone to be put into the bloodstream, to travel through the bloodstream, blah, 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 blah. However, it has widespread effects. Not sure if you can hear Oscar purring. Yes, okay. Because the hormones, and these are the traditional hormones, because they go into the bloodstream, they can have widespread effects. They're very powerful. Even a small change in a hormone can have powerful, widespread effects because these boogers go everywhere. And their responses are more prolonged. Growth hormone can cause, once it gets to a muscle or bone, can cause growth for 8, 10, 12, 18 hours. All right. I like this compare and contrast. This is a visual view that shows us, the nerve impulse the nervous system communicates through a nerve impulse. It travels to more localized things. It's quick, but short-lasting. On the other hand, the hormones, which is how we communicate through the endocrine system, goes into the bloodstream, can have more widespread, long-lasting effects. Here are some extra notes. You don't need to know these. There's just a couple points that I have to say to make sure I'm doing my job here. Some things are both. Again, this will not be on a test or the final, but I just want to point it out to throw it out to you. Some things are both. They work as hormones and in the nervous system. The two examples that I want to point out are norepinephrine and epinephrine. We've heard of these, adrenaline, we know all about it. Guess what? These are hormones released by the adrenal glands above the kidneys, and they're also neurotransmitters released from the ends of neurons. So wow, some of them function in both the endocrine and the nervous system. They obviously have overlapping effects. Aren't organs and muscles going to receive both nerve impulses and hormones? Yes. Okay. Again, not going to be on the test, but I just wanted to point it out. A couple other points, and then we'll be done with this. Unlike other body systems that had one master control center, the endocrine doesn't. Remember, the endocrine has a series of glands spread all throughout the body, from the brain to above the kidneys, to above the heart, to the groin region. And there's not one master control center. The nervous system does have a master control center, which is the brain, of course. So the endocrine doesn't have one control center. However, there is one place that oversees the most, and that would be the hypothalamus. Because this oversees the pituitary gland, which secretes the most hormones out of any other gland, and by the way, the hypothalamus also secretes some hormones itself. So this has the greatest influence. It's not the master control center over every hormone or gland, but it oversees the most. Okay. How do we regulate the endocrine system? Through negative feedback. If something gets too low, hypothalamus gets notified and we do something to bring it back up. If something gets too high, hypothalamus gets notified, we do something to bring it back down. I'm not going to get into that right now. I will use an example later. For now, just suffice to say that it's overseen, it works through negative feedback loops. All right, I just want to introduce the general anatomy. We know that the endocrine system is composed of glands that release hormones. We have to include target cells. Where do those hormones go to have their effects? Target cells. And depending on the hormone, the target cell is different. Growth hormone, easy example. Growth hormone is produced from the pituitary gland. So as an example, pituitary gland releases growth hormone into the bloodstream. Where does growth hormone go? Its target cell is the muscle or bone. So every hormone has a target cell, whether it be the skin, whether it be the liver, whether it be a muscle. So at some point, every area in your body is a target cell because it's going to be receiving messages from hormones. But the target cell is specific to the hormone. Okay. We have two main types of glands, exocrine and endocrine. Most of our glands are exocrine. So this is most common. Jeez. I'll blame Oscar. He was scratching something behind me. Most of our glands are endocrine. When we say endocrine, releases hormones directly into the bloodstream. We do have an example of an exocrine gland, which is the pancreas. An exocrine gland utilizes ducts, which we already talked about in the digestive system. So instead of hormones being released directly into the bloodstream, they go into a duct first, which eventually leads to the bloodstream. This is the last thing I want to introduce, and then I'll be done. Types of hormones. 3 main categories: peptide, monoamine, and steroid. I've put in the color what you need to know. Peptide hormones are made up of amino acids, hence the name peptide. It's the most common. Most of our hormones that we think of are peptide. For example, here's insulin. Insulin is a long chain of amino acids. Growth hormone, long chain of amino acids. Then there's a second category called monoamines. They're amino acid derivatives. So it's not just the amino acid chain. They're chemicals that are derived from amino acid. We have epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the thyroid hormones. Just memorization, folks. Most hormones are peptide, long amino acid chains. Some hormones are monoamine. They're derived from amino acids, but as you can see from this picture, they look very different. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and thyroid. And then lastly, we have our steroid hormones. These are made up of lipids or fats, and these are our sex hormones. All right. When I see you next, we will get into more of the details. All right, thanks, folks.